Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today we're diving back into the Silmarillion and summarizing Chapter 4 of Thingol and Melian. Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the Librarian. I hope you're excited to dive back into the Silmarillion today because I know I am. Today we are on Chapter 4. Now this is the shortest chapter in the Silmarillion. There are a lot of short chapters in the Silmarillion, especially here towards the beginning, but this one is the shortest by far. It's really less than 2 pages of text. It's called Of Thingol and Melian, and that's really all it is. It's just about Thingol and Melian, and really only a tiny little bit of their overall story. So let's dive in. We'll do what we normally do here. We'll go over the vocabulary for this chapter. We'll talk about who the major characters are, what the major events are, and we'll follow up on any major themes that are going on. So starting off with the vocabulary, we first have one really important word here, and we've encountered this word before, and it is Maya, or the plural is Maiar. Now this is important because this chapter is about Melian, and Melian is a Maya. If you cast your mind back to when we were talking about the Valaquenta, we learned about the Maya there, but we haven't talked a lot about them since. The Maya are essentially the second tier of angelic beings or gods, depending on how Tolkien was talking about them at any given time. They're kind of that second tier. Those beings are known collectively as the Ainur. So within the Ainur, there are these 2 separate classes. The Valar, which we've talked about a lot, so hopefully you're starting to become familiar with them, and the Maiar. Powerful beings, but they aren't like the top tier most powerful beings. And in this chapter, we're going to get to know Melian, who's probably the Maya that we get to know the best, besides maybe Gandalf, really. And so we'll talk more about that in the character section. As far as more vocabulary words go, there aren't a ton in this chapter because it is so short, but there's a few more that I want to bring up. First, let's talk about Teleri. Now the Teleri we already encountered last time, so if you want to know more about them, you can go back and watch the last video about Chapter 3. But just as a reminder, the Teleri are those elves that left last on the Great Journey, and Elwë was their leader, and also Olwë his brother. So we'll talk more about them in the characters as well, but just remember the Teleri, those are those elves that are coming last, and most of them aren't going to make it all the way to Valinor. Next, we have a new word for a subset of elves. Imagine that. We had so many last time, but here's a new one, and that is the Sindar. The Sindar are a subgroup of Teleri, and the Teleri are the ones who followed Elwë, and when Elwë disappears, spoiler alert for the rest of this chapter, Olwë, his brother, takes over, but those who stay behind, who continue to look for Elwë, those become the Sindar. They're going to be an important group of elves. They won't come up all of the time, but it's important to know who they are. Now we just have 2 geography words. We don't delve a lot into geography on this because I know it can get confusing, but I want you to kind of know a few place names so you can at least be oriented in the story. And these 2 are important. The first one is Menegroth. Menegroth is the 1,000 Caves, and that is where Thingol and Melian are going to live for the rest of this book. So it's good to know when you hear Menegroth, that's the 1,000 Caves. It's basically their palace, but it's made out of caves. And then Doriath. And Doriath is where Menegroth is. Doriath is a larger region, and it's basically their kingdom. So Thingol and Melian, their kingdom is Doriath. And that's going to be an important location in a bunch of the stories that we read in the Silmarillion. Okay, now let's move on to major characters. We've already been hinting at this and talking about them a little bit, but of course, first up we have Melian. Melian, like we've said, is a Maya. So she is an angelic being, but she comes into the world after the children of Iluvatar awake. And she is going to be really, really critically important. She's going to be the wife of Thingol, and from them, it's going to be all of these important characters in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. So if you're coming from the Lord of the Rings, some of the descendants of Melian are going to be people like Elrond and his brother Elros, and then their descendants, Aragorn and Arwen, which you will definitely know. So not only is Melian a really important character herself, but her descendants will be really critical to all of these stories. The thing to understand about Melian is she is basically on another level, right? She is not an elf. She basically takes on the form of an elf, but she isn't, which means she is immensely powerful. She is almost more powerful than anybody else we're going to meet in this story besides anyone who is a Vala. And she is very wise, but what you'll see throughout the stories is that her wisdom is not always listened to, and that becomes kind of a hallmark of her character. She really kind of operates above everyone who is around her, including Thingol, her husband. Which brings us, of course, to the next character, which is Elwë/Thingol. He's going to be called both, so that can get a little confusing. Just understand they are the same character, but through most of the rest of the story, he'll be called Thingol. I know that's confusing. Just stick with me. Basically, this is the guy who was one of the three who got taken to Valinor to see the trees, and then came back and convinced everyone else to go. So he's leading everyone else to go, and remember, he and his brother Olwe have the largest group, the Teleri. And the thing is, Elwë is not going to make it back, and that's going to come up in the events, but Elwë isn't going to make it back. He's going to become the leader of the Sindar and establish that kingdom of Doriath with Melian. Now, another name that comes up briefly in this chapter, but is important, so we want to mention him, is Finwë. Finwë is one of those three elves as well, who went to Valinor and then came back to convince the others. He's the leader of the Noldor. Now, he doesn't play an important role in this chapter, except that his buddy, Elwë, is coming to try and find him when the major event of the chapter happens. But it's good just to remember that Finwë is there, because he and his children and their descendants are going to be really, really important to the entire rest of the story. In this chapter, he's just Elwë's friend, who Elwë is trying to go visit when he gets lost in the woods. And then lastly for characters, we have Olwë. We've already mentioned Olwë. He's Elwë's brother, and he's the one who's going to take the kingship and control of the Teleri in the absence of his brother Elwë. And that's it for the characters. Now let's go ahead and talk about the major events that happen here, or in the case of this really short chapter, the major event. The major event is the meeting of Thingol and Melian. That's really what this chapter is all about. Elwë, who will be known as Thingol, is wandering through the woods looking for Finwë, and he becomes enchanted by nightingales and hears the song of Melian. And then he walks and walks and walks until he finds her, and then they basically stand and stare at each other for years and years. It is a long time. It says that the trees around them grew tall and dark while they stood there. So we're not talking about a few minutes that seem like a long time. We're not talking about a few hours. We're talking about years and years of time, during which Elwë's people will mostly depart with Olwë as their leader, and only those that stay behind, which will become the Sindar, are still there looking for him when they finally come out of what's essentially this trance. That's the major event. Nothing else really happens, but we're told some other things in the chapter, the most important of which is the very last sentence, which says, "And of the love of Thingol and Melian there came into the world the fairest of all the children of Iluvatar that was or ever shall be." So this is the big moment of foreshadowing, basically telling us that something big is going to come from the child of Thingol and Melian. So we will have to stay tuned for a while until that pays off, but stick with us because it's going to be good once we get there. Now, the last thing we need to talk about today is the major themes. We've been tracking several major themes in the Silmarillion so far, but none of them really make an appearance in this very, very short chapter. However, we are introduced to one new and important theme, one that Tolkien brings up many times. It's almost a trope with Tolkien, and that is a powerful guy who is wandering through the woods who becomes enchanted by an even more powerful girl. So we have Thingol and Melian, and we're going to see that pattern repeated in this story. And of course, we see it repeated again in of Aragorn and Arwen in The Lord of the Rings. Keep kind of attuned to that because Tolkien likes to bring this up, and many people would say it's actually autobiographical for him, his way of portraying his own love for his wife. Keep that in mind as we go forward here. Now, I know this was a short chapter. It won't take you long to read it, but I would love to hear from you what you do think of it. Go ahead and drop in the comments. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know how you're enjoying the Silmarillion. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. Farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.